If you're someone that follows my channel, odds are you're an MMO fan or you're looking out for good upcoming MMORPGs to play. But what exactly separates a good MMO from a bad one? Why is it that in 2019 the most anticipated MMORPG release is World of Warcraft Classic? In this video I'm going to talk about what I think makes a good MMORPG and why the new MMOs we've had over the past few years just don't cut the mustard. Obviously this video is somewhat subjective because everyone has their own ideas as to what a good MMO is. For me, I think the most important aspect of an MMORPG is that it gives me, the player, the feeling, even if it's an illusion, that I'm in some way making my own story and not just following a linear quest line that every player follows. I personally don't like linear story-driven MMOs because I just end up thinking to myself, I might as well play a single-player game that's designed purely to tell a story without the grind of an MMO. One of the main things I liked about Classic WoW was that despite it being a theme park MMO, it had a lot more of a sandbox feeling to it in regards to the questing and leveling process when compared to current WoW. Each race has their own starting area at different parts of the map. Every few levels you had the choice between 2 or 3 different zones that you could be leveling in, and when it came to the questing and storytelling, most of these stories were self-contained adventures from the town or quest hub you was leveling from. You didn't just follow a singular main quest line, you actually had to go out and find quests, which felt rewarding in itself. This approach to design gave me the feeling that I'm just a random adventurer out exploring the world rather than the main character or chosen one narrative that so many modern MMOs seem to miss the mark with. Old School RuneScape's another game that also does a great job with this kind of adventurer approach and gives you the feeling at every stage of the game that you're the one in control. You decide how you want to progress. The game still has questing, but again these are self-contained quality over quantity quests that give the game a bit of structure. When it comes to MMOs, I think there's 3 categories when it comes to structure. Category A, your character is the chosen one that plays through a mostly linear quest line. The leveling in these games are typically more story driven, sometimes handholdy, and you feel like everyone has the same leveling experience. Category B, your character is the chosen one, there is a main quest line, however there's plenty of self-contained quests and player choice when it comes to progression and leveling. And then you've got Category C, your character's just a random adventurer, there's little to no main story, most quests are self-contained stories, and you have a lot more choice when it comes to the path you take when progressing and leveling. For me personally, I definitely prefer MMOs in categories B and C, and I really hope we can get back to seeing more MMOs where our characters are just random adventurers and have no real story or lore significance. The next most important thing a good MMO has, in my opinion, is the ability to create unique player-driven encounters that make the game feel massively multiplayer. If you've spoken to someone that's played RuneScape, Black Desert Online, Arcade Lineage 2, Vanilla WoW or EverQuest, odds are they have some kind of awesome or sad story about an experience they had in one of those games. Maybe they got lured into the wilderness in RuneScape, they participated in a massive pirate war out at sea against 3 other guilds in Arcade, maybe they got into an argument that resulted in a guild feud and war in Black Desert, or they defended castles in Lineage. My point is, a good MMO has its players tell war stories and create memories about encounters with other players, stories that are unique to either the individual or the guild. This is usually done through some form of sandboxy feature like capturing land and castles as a guild, full loot PvP, a game having some form of trading system where players can steal trade packs from one another, bounty systems, implementing extremely rare legendary gear that only a few people on the server will obtain, secret quest lines, hidden treasures, and rare world bosses that have very long spawn times. To some extent, most of this boils down to risk versus reward, and having either very difficult and memorable content, or having special one-off server-wide events such as the opening of Anchorage Gates in Vanilla WoW. This is the point where I feel a lot of modern MMOs have been lacking. What cool, unique stories could I possibly share about modern WoW outside of World First Mythic raiding? I can't think of any. Same for Final Fantasy XIV, Neverwinter, Blade and Soul, and so on. A good MMO needs to give players the systems and boundaries in which they can create memorable, unique encounters against other players, or at the very least, not place restrictions on the cool shit players will find to do to have fun. I don't think endgame difficulty is much of an issue for most MMOs, but I think the difficulty of leveling has become a joke for pretty much every modern MMO, to the point where it feels like you're just going through the motions, your brain's turned off, you're watching Netflix on your other monitor, dick in hand. For me, a good MMO has leveling with difficulty to the point where I feel engaged enough to at least look at the screen, plan things out, and if I fuck up there's the very real possibility of me dying. Dying also needs to have consequences, such as a long corpse run, a debuff, or something along those lines, otherwise there's no feeling of risk versus reward. I think vanilla World of Warcraft nailed difficulty pretty well. It wasn't mega hard, but if you pulled too many mobs or went into a fight half health with no mana, you'd die, and rightly so. I think nowadays a lot of devs are scared to make the leveling process of MMOs too difficult because A, they think we're all dumb, and B, they're worried about scaring off the casual audience. I guess it's a case of finding the right balance of difficulty, but I think catering to the lowest common denominator just results in players feeling apathy towards leveling due to having no emotional reaction to the lack of difficulty and risk versus reward that they encounter. Pay-to-win monetization is something that can straight up ruin a very good MMO. Arcade and Black Desert Online are two examples of this. The reason I dislike the free-to-play business model with MMOs is that devs are incentivized to create problems to then sell solutions. Problems such as limited inventory space, limited weight, RNG upgrade systems where you can pay for a higher success chance, time-gated content that's core to progression that you can bypass by spending money. These are things that all suck about pay-to-win MMOs. Personally, I'd even go as far as saying I don't like cosmetic cash shops, as I think they devalue the cool in-game items players obtain. Personally, I'd rather an MMO charge a sub fee, a box cost, and charge for expansions, if it means the integrity of the game can be maintained. I think combat is obviously important to MMORPGs, but I don't think it's quite as important as the other stuff I've mentioned so far. A good combat system is super subjective, and a lot of people just think of it as an argument of action combat versus tab targeting, when in reality it's not quite that simple. You can have action combat games with awful clunky animation locked abilities, and you can have tab target games that are fluid, fast paced, and well animated. For me, a good action combat system has to be well animated, impactful, not lock animation for too long, and it needs to have a certain level of depth to it. What's the point of an action combat system if I've only got 4 or 5 abilities? A good tab targeting system for me has a reasonably short global cooldown, but not too short like Blade and Soul where it feels kinda spammy. There needs to be plenty of off global cooldown abilities, and most abilities shouldn't root you in place with long ass animations. An example of a game with great tab targeting in my opinion is Arcade. For me, I don't think I can objectively say what's better out of action combat and tab targeting, but a few observations is that action combat seems to work best for PvP MMOs, and tab targeting seems to work best for PvE due to the Holy Trinity. A big problem with action combat is that it seems very difficult to design fun and difficult PvE content for it, and the problem with tab targeting is that at times it can feel a bit old and tired. Either way, I'm fine with both combat systems as long as it follows the design principles I've previously mentioned, or maybe some kind of hybrid system's the way forward if done correctly. When it comes to the whole PvP vs PvE debate, I think a good MMORPG should have both, and there should be systems in place to tie them together in some way to create a dynamic where PvP is the risk and PvE is the reward. A great example of this done correctly is in old school RuneScape. There's an area of the game called the Wilderness that features full loot PvP. However, the Wilderness also has by far some of the best PvE money making areas and bosses if you can grind there for a reasonable amount of time. This creates a situation where the PvE players are risking the gear against PvP players so they can make big money from bosses and wilderness monsters. Something I used to love about WoW back in Wrath of the Lich King was the PvP map Wintergrasp. It was a siege battle that happened every 3 hours, and the faction that won the fight got exclusive access to the raid inside of the castle. This created a nice incentive for PvE players to get involved with PvP. Just to be clear though, I don't think all content should be designed as PvP vs PvE, and there should be some separation as to not create too big of a divide in the community. Things like dungeons, raids, battlegrounds and arenas are fine as they are. For me, a good MMO has systems in place that allows players to feel some kind of social status from within the game's community. Examples of this can be server or world first achievements, time limited achievements and cosmetics for completing content whilst it's relevant, guild logos, castles and lands that guilds can own, real space player housing, super legendary pieces of gear that only a few people will ever obtain, and so on. The point here is to give players the feeling like they've played a part in the history of their server and made an impact. For me, this is one of the core appeals to the idea of playing a massive virtual world. Making a name for yourself as a completely different persona, it's the ultimate form of escapism. I guess another aspect of community also has to do with how close the developers are with the people that play the game. If you as a player feel as though the devs actually play the MMO, they do Q&As, they listen to feedback and allow players to vote on updates, then you're probably going to feel a part of the game's community as a whole and stick around for future content. Something I'm unsure about when it comes to MMOs is the topic of transmog. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. On one hand, not having a transmog/wardrobe system allows you to see exactly what another player has equipped without inspecting them. If you look like a badass, then you're most likely wearing good gear and as a result, probably have a higher sense of status and pride, possibly inspiring players around you to achieve the same gear. At the same time though, transmog and fashion is quite a fun side thing you can do at endgame in MMOs to chill out and get creative, so honestly I'm kinda torn on that one. Same for player housing really. I think real space player housing is super cool as it allows players to feel like they actually live in the world, but at the same time you can't design a world where every player has their own real space player house, and therefore you need to consider some instanced housing. My question is, does the instanced housing devalue the real space player housing to the point where it's no longer cool? I'm really not sure, I guess there's an argument for either one. But just to wrap this video up, to me a good MMO has the following. It makes you feel like an adventurer through lots of choices and mystery. The game has systems in place that allow for unique encounters between players resulting in cool stories. The game has multiple ways to show your status within the game's community, either via guild recognition or rare hard to obtain items that not everyone will get. Quest stories are self-contained and instead of one overarching linear story, tell multiple small stories that give meaning to the world. The game combines a mixture of both PvP and PvE to give a sense of risk versus reward. Combat is fluid, doesn't lock you in animation for too long, has a reasonable skill cap, and abilities are impactful and distinct. The game isn't pay to win. The game isn't too sandboxy to the point where you don't know what to do. Sandbox elements are great, but there's also content to give structure to the game. And the game has a reasonable level of difficulty throughout to keep you engaged. But that's pretty much it for what I think makes a good MMORPG. Taking my criteria, I don't think there's been a single MMO that ticks all the boxes yet, but then again, I'm very particular about what I like and what I don't like. Hopefully this video gave you a bit of an insight into my personal tastes when it comes to MMOs, and I'd love to hear a summary of what you guys think makes a good MMORPG in the comments below. Thanks for watching, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you again really soon.